What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Sunday, August 8th.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate today, so let's take a look at the pitcher position. I like Lance McCullers Jr. with a 10% pitching advantage over a low-salary batting team, the Minnesota Twins. Lance McCullers Jr. is only giving up a .595 OPS versus lefties and a .657 OPS versus righties. He's facing 3 lefties and 5 righties, and the Twins have only hit 7 of his last 30 pitches. That's a .233 batting average. He's 9,800 FanDuel salary, and he's 200 more on DraftKings. Projected at 24.9 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 30 fantasy points or more in this one. He has an ERA of 3.02. His record is 9-2 on the season, pitching an average of 93 pitches per game, averaging 35 fantasy points per game. He scored 0, 57, and 36 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Lance McCullers Jr. here versus the Minnesota Twins. Okay, now if you want to save some salary and roll the dice and go with a risky pitcher, I think this guy's in a pretty decent spot. Take a look at Zach Plesac. He's pitching against a low-salary batting team, the Detroit Tigers. He's only giving up a .511 OPS versus lefties and a .648 OPS versus righties. He's facing 2 lefties and 5 righties. But the reason I think this pick is interesting, because the Tigers have only hit 4 of his last 36 pitches. That's a .111 batting average. And he's only 7,200 FanDuel salary. He's 1,200 more on DraftKings. Projected at 24.1 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 4.64. Record is 5-4 on the season. Pitching an average of 86 pitches per game, averaging 22 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of a bad game. He scored -3, 27, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games. But this will let you stack your bats. I think he's worth a risk or worth a gamble. So I like Zach Plesac here versus the Detroit Tigers. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. I like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. batting against a low salary pitcher, Garrett Richards. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is batting 6% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .921 OPS versus righties, and Garrett Richards is giving up a .764 OPS versus righties. But the reason I like this pick is because Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is 7 for 12, batting a .583 batting average and a 1.750 OPS versus Richards. He's 4,400 FanDuel salary and 1,800 more on DraftKings. Projected at 10.6 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score a whole lot more than that. He's averaging 14 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 6, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I think he's due for a big game here. So I like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. here versus Garrett Richards. I also like Joey Votto with a 43% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Joey Votto is batting 33% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .954 OPS versus righties. And Bryce Wilson, he pitches 11% worse to lefties as he does righties, giving up a .888 OPS versus lefties. Now, there's no at-bats versus Wilson yet. Joey Votto is $4,100 FanDuel salary, $1,700 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's been on fire, scoring 25, 6, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Joey Votto here versus Bryce Wilson. Okay, now here's a value play for you. I like Tucker Barnhart with a 53% batting advantage over that same low-salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Tucker Barnhart is batting 43% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .760 OPS versus righties. And we know Bryce Wilson is giving up a .888 OPS versus lefties. There's no at-bats versus Wilson yet, but the reason I like this pick is because Tucker Barnhart is only $2,200 FanDuel salary. He's $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 26, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Tucker Barnhart here versus Bryce Wilson. Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. I like Brandon Lowe with a 21% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Jorge Lopez. Brandon Lowe bats 5% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .871 OPS versus righties. And Jorge Lopez, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 16% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .983 OPS versus lefties. Now, Brandon Lowe is 4 for 6, batting a .667 batting average and a 1.5 OPS versus Lopez. He's $3,300 FanDuel salary. He's $2,300 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 45, 0, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Brandon Lowe here versus Jorge Lopez.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Now, here's a value play on FanDuel. I like Mike Moustakas with a 46% batting advantage over that same low-salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. So we could stack some righty batters here. We could stack some lefty batters or switch hitters here versus Bryce Wilson. Mike Moustakas, he's batting 35% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .880 OPS versus righties. We know Bryce Wilson is giving up a .888 OPS versus lefties, and Mike Moustakas is 1 for 2 versus Wilson with a 1.5 OPS. That one hit was a double. Now, he's only $2,500 FanDuel salary. He's projected at 10.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 31, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Mike Moustakas as a value play on FanDuel here versus Bryce Wilson. I also like Ozzie Albies with a small batting advantage here versus Patrick Corbin. Ozzie Albies is batting a .701 OPS versus lefties, and Patrick Corbin, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 14% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .911 OPS versus switch hitters. I like this pick because Ozzie Albies is 8 for 22, batting a .364 batting average and a .939 OPS versus Corbin. He's $3,300 FanDuel salary, $1,600 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 6, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Ozzie Albies here versus Patrick Corbin. Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Joey Wendell with a 44% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Jorge Lopez. Joey Wendell is batting 28% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .824 OPS versus righties. And Jorge Lopez, we know he throws his worst ball versus lefty batters, 16% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .983 OPS versus lefties. Joey Wendell is 3 for 8, batting a .375 batting average and a 1 OPS versus Lopez. He's only $2,500 FanDuel salary. He's $1,800 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 22, 7, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. Now I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 10.5 runs scored in this game, so a high scoring game. So I like Joey Wendell here versus Jorge Lopez. I also like J.D. Davis with an 18% batting advantage over Zach Wheeler. J.D. Davis is batting 21% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .872 OPS versus righties, and Zach Wheeler is giving up a .623 OPS versus righties. But the reason I like this pick is because J.D. Davis is 5 for 12, that's a .417 batting average, and a 1.250 OPS versus Wheeler. He's $3,000 FanDuel salary and only $400 more on DraftKings. Projected at 9.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 0, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like J.D. Davis here versus Zach Wheeler. Okay, now here's another value play. I like Maikel Franco with an 8% batting advantage over Michael Wacha. Maikel Franco is batting a .700 OPS versus righties, and Michael Wacha, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 11% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .972 OPS versus righties. So I like this pick because Maikel Franco is 5 for 16, batting a .312 batting average and a .937 OPS versus Wacha. Franco is $2,800 FanDuel salary, and he's $200 less on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites, but I love that DraftKings price. He's projected at 8.7 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 12, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Maikel Franco here versus Michael Wacha. Okay, let's take a look at the shortstop position. I like Xander Bogaerts with a 9% batting advantage over Hyun-Jin Ryu. Xander Bogaerts is batting 11% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .938 OPS versus lefties, and Hyun-Jin Ryu is giving up a .644 OPS versus righties. But I like this pick because Xander Bogaerts is 5 for 12, batting .417 batting average, and a 1.295 OPS versus Ryu. He's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $2,000 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 7, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Xander Bogaerts here versus Hyun-Jin Ryu. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. I like Jesse Winker with a 41% batting advantage over Bryce Wilson. So we can really stack these lefties versus Bryce Wilson if you want. Jesse Winker is batting 30% better versus righty pitchers, batting a 1.005 OPS versus righties. And Bryce Wilson, we know he pitches 11% worse to lefties as he does righties, giving up a .888 OPS versus lefties. Now, there's no at-bats versus Wilson yet, and Jesse Winker is $4,100 FanDuel salary. He's $1,800 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 13 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 48, 34, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Jesse Winker here versus Bryce Wilson. Okay, now here's another value play. I like Tommy Edman with a 27% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Kris Bubic. Tommy Edman is batting 27% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .859 OPS versus lefties, and Kris Bubic is giving up a .827 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Bubic yet, but Tommy Edman is only $2,800 FanDuel salary, $400 more on DraftKings, projected at 10 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 0, and 9 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Tommy Edman here versus Kris Bubic.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.